She stood in the magistrate's office with her hands bound, her cloak torn and muddy, facing the man she had loved in silence for 3 years. The Duke of Wetherby stared at her as if she were a stranger, his grey-green eyes cold with fury and confusion. Behind him, the Bow Street runner held the rope that proved her crime, stolen from a duke's stable, caught racing through London on a horse worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. The magistrate was already reaching for his sentencing book. Horse theft, a capital crime. She could hang for this. But it was the Duke's voice that broke her, quiet and deadly. "Why did you do it, Miss Ashcroft? Why did you steal my horse?" And Eleanor, who had spent 3 years making herself invisible, who had nothing left to lose, looked him in the eye and said the 4 words that would change everything: "To save your life." Before I tell you how we got here, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you haven't subscribed to Jane Tells Stories yet, please do. I promise you, this story is worth it. In fact, if you don't subscribe, you owe me a favor. Now, let me take you back to the Coaching Inn, to the rain-soaked night when Eleanor Ashcroft committed a crime that would either destroy her or set her free. The rain began at 9 o'clock. A steady London drizzle that turned the cobblestones of the Bull and Mouth coaching yard into a river of mud and horse manure and reflected lamplight. Eleanor Ashcroft stood in the shadow of the ostler's shed, her plain grey cloak pulled tight against her shoulders, and watched the Duke of Wetherby's travelling chariot being made ready for departure. She had known for 3 hours. 3 hours since Lady Otterline Vane had dictated a letter to her goddaughter Cordelia Hartwell, gloating about the delicious scandal of an elopement, since Eleanor's fingers had stilled on the pen and her blood had turned to ice in her veins. 3 hours since she had learned that the man she loved, the only man she had ever loved, the man she had loved in silence for 3 years, was about to destroy himself. Cordelia Hartwell was beautiful. Cordelia Hartwell was rich, with a fortune of £120,000 that made her the season's greatest prize. Cordelia Hartwell was also cruel, vindictive, and drowning in gambling debts that her father had refused to settle for the 3rd time in as many months. Eleanor knew this because she managed Lady Otterline's correspondence, because she read the letters that others discarded, because she had spent 3 years making herself useful and invisible, and had become, in the process, a repository of secrets she never wanted to hold. She knew that Cordelia had selected the Duke as her target 6 months ago, after her previous engagement to a baronet's son had ended in a hunting accident that had nearly killed the young man and from which Cordelia had emerged singularly unmoved. She knew that Cordelia had accepted his proposal not out of affection, but out of calculation. His title was the highest in England. His reserve made him a challenge, and his estates, though presently in distress, would recover magnificently under a wife's fortune and a wife's control. Eleanor knew, with a certainty that sat in her stomach like a stone, that if Augustus St. John, Duke of Wetherby, reached Gretna Green with Cordelia Hartwell, he would spend the rest of his life in a cage of his own making. He would be managed, manipulated, bled dry of whatever remained of his pride and his warmth, until he became one of those hollow men who walked through drawing rooms with empty eyes and empty hearts, having surrendered everything for duty and gained nothing but misery. She could not let it happen. Not for herself. She had no hope where he was concerned. She was 26 years old, plain, poor, and employed as a companion to one of the most unpleasant women in Mayfair. She had known since she was 19 and he was 25. Since her father had lain dying in a narrow Oxford bed, and the young Duke had sat with them through 3 afternoons, discussing philosophy and politics and poetry, that she loved him. She had also known, with equal certainty, that she would never speak of it. She was the daughter of a don. He was a duke. The mathematics of the world did not permit such equations. But she loved him still, quietly, desperately, without expectation or demand. And because she loved him, she could not watch him walk into a trap without trying to stop him. The problem was that she had no standing, no right, no voice that anyone would heed. She was a companion. She was nobody. If she wrote to him, he would not believe her, would assume jealousy, malice, the petty spite of a woman beneath his notice. If she confronted Cordelia, she would be ruined, dismissed without reference, turned out into the street. If she told Lady Otterline, the Viscountess would laugh and carry the tale to Cordelia as further proof of Eleanor's insolence. She had no plan. She had only the certainty of disaster and the desperate, half-mad impulse to delay it. The yard was busy. The mail coach to Edinburgh was being readied at the far end, horses being changed, drivers shouting across the rain. The Duke's chariot, a sleek black vehicle with his crest on the door, stood near the stable entrance, its lamps lit, the postilions already mounted. Inside, she knew, he sat with Cordelia. Perhaps he was holding her hand. Perhaps he was telling himself that this was the right thing, the sensible thing, the only thing left to a man with responsibilities and empty coffers. Perhaps he was not thinking at all, he having made himself numb to the necessity of the act. Eleanor moved. She had not planned to enter the stable. She had not planned to do anything at all. But her feet carried her across the yard, into the warm darkness of the stable block, past the rows of horses shifting in their stalls. She knew horses. Her father had kept a small stable in Oxford, and she had learned to ride as a girl, scandalously astride, with her skirts hitched up and her hair coming loose. It was one of the secret skills she had buried when she became a companion, one of the pieces of herself she had folded away like out-of-season clothing. The Duke's horse was unmistakable. A black gelding of 17 hands, named Satan, with the irony that men apply to animals they cannot control. He was being held by a groom near the stable entrance, saddled for a postilion, his coat gleaming in the lamplight. He was the fastest horse in the Duke's stable. He was meant to be ridden ahead of the chariot, to clear the road, to ensure that no obstacle delayed the elopement. Eleanor walked up to the groom. She was a woman in a grey cloak, unremarkable, forgettable. The groom barely looked at her. "I'll hold him," she said. Her voice was steady. "The postilion sent me. There's a change in the arrangements." The groom frowned. "No one told me. It's a private matter, the Duke's orders." She said it with such calm assurance that the groom, who was tired and wet and eager to be done with his shift, handed her the reins. "Mind his temper, then. He's fresh tonight." She led the horse out of the stable, into the rain, around the corner of the building where the shadows were deepest. Then she did the thing she had not truly believed she would do until she was doing it. She gathered her skirts, found the stirrup, and mounted. Satan shifted beneath her, surprised by a rider who smelled of lavender rather than leather, by a seat that was lighter and differently balanced. Eleanor gathered the reins, leaned forward, and whispered into his ear, "Forgive me." Then she kicked him into a gallop. The yard erupted. Shouts, curses, the clatter of hooves on stone as she drove him through the coaching inn's archway and out into the London night. She had not ridden in 3 years, but her body remembered. The rhythm, the balance, the terrible, exhilarating freedom of speed. The rain stung her face. The wind tore at her cloak. She drove him north, away from the inn, away from the chariot, but away from the man she loved, and toward an empty road that led nowhere she wanted to go. She had no destination. She had no plan. She had only the desperate animal need to buy time. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. Long enough for someone to notice the Duke's absence. Long enough for Cordelia's father to intercept them. Long enough for something, anything, to prevent the catastrophe she could not bear to watch. She knew, even as she rode, that it was futile, that she would be caught, that a woman in a grey cloak on a duke's horse could not disappear in London, not in 1819, not with watchmen on every corner and the Bow Street runners never more than a shout away. She knew that she had committed a felony, that horse theft was a capital crime under the bloody code, that she could be transported to Australia or hanged for what she was doing. She did not care. Or rather, she cared too much about the wrong thing to care about the right ones. She had spent 3 years being invisible, being useful, being nobody. She had spent 3 years watching the man she loved from across ballrooms, from behind tea trays, from the edges of rooms where women like her were furniture. She had spent 3 years telling herself that love without hope was still love, that silent devotion had its own dignity, that she could live on crumbs of his presence and never ask for more. Tonight, she was done with silence. Not because she expected him to love her in return, not because she imagined he would sweep her into his arms and declare that he had loved her all along. She was not so foolish, not so deluded, and not so poisoned by novels. She knew exactly what she was, a plain, poor, 26-year-old companion who had committed a crime that would destroy her. But she also knew what he was, a good man who had lost his way, a man who had sat with her dying father and discussed Seneca and Montaigne and the rights of man, who had laughed at her father's jokes and brought him oranges and never once made him feel like a burden. A man who had inherited a dukedom he never wanted, who had buried his father and his brother in the same month at 21, who had spent 11 years shouldering responsibilities with a quiet endurance that broke her heart. He deserved better than Cordelia Hartwell. He deserved better than a marriage of mutual advantage. He deserved to be loved, truly loved, for the man he was rather than the title he bore. And if she could not be the one to love him, if she could never tell him, never show him, never hope for anything in return, then she could at least prevent him from making a mistake that would poison the rest of his life. She rode for perhaps 15 minutes, north along the Tottenham Court Road, past the darkened shops and the occasional pool of lamplight. The rain was heavier now, turning the road to mud, making Satan's hooves slip and skitter. She was cold, soaked to the skin, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of terror and exhilaration she had never known. Then she heard the shouts behind her. Halt! In the name of the law! Watchmen. 2 of them, with lanterns, emerging from a side street. They had seen the horse, his distinctive size, his colour, the Duke's crest on the saddlecloth. They had been alerted, perhaps by the groom, perhaps by the chaos at the coaching inn. They were running now, waving their staves, shouting for assistance. Eleanor pulled Satan to a stop. She could not outrun them, not through London streets, not on a horse that was already tiring, not in a city where every corner might hold another watchman. She could fight, perhaps, but she was not armed, and she was not violent, and she could not bring herself to strike a man who was only doing his duty. She sat very still on the horse's back, the rain running down her face, and waited for them to reach her. The first watchman grabbed Satan's bridle. The second shone his lantern directly into Eleanor's face, and she saw his expression shift from suspicion to confusion to something like pity. "A woman," he said, as if he could not believe it. "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm. She had found, somewhere in the chaos of the last half hour, a strange and terrible peace. I stole the horse. I surrender myself to the law. The watchman blinked. They were not accustomed to confessions. They were accustomed to lies, to denials, to desperate attempts at escape. A woman who sat on a stolen horse in the rain and announced her own guilt was outside their experience. "Come down, then," the first watchman said, gentler than she expected. "Slowly, mind. No trouble." She dismounted. Her legs were shaking, her skirts heavy with water, her hair coming loose from its pins and plastered to her neck. She looked, she knew, like a drowned rat, like a madwoman, like exactly the sort of creature who would steal a duke's horse in the middle of the night. "What's your name?" the second watchman asked. "Oh, Eleanor Ashcroft." "And why do you steal His Grace's horse, Miss Ashcroft?" She looked at him, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes, a man who had probably never stolen anything in his life, who could not imagine what would drive a woman to such an act. "I cannot tell you," she said. "I am sorry." They put her in handcuffs. The metal was cold against her wrists, biting into her skin. They led her back through the streets, Satan following behind on a lead rope, his hooves clopping a funeral march on the wet cobblestones. The walk took perhaps 20 minutes, but it felt like hours, an endless procession of shame, of curious faces at windows, of whispered speculation that would be all over London by morning. They returned to the Bull and Mouth. The yard was quieter now. The mail coach had departed. The other passengers had retreated indoors. But the Duke's chariot still stood near the stable entrance, its lamps still lit. And as the watchman led her across the yard, the door opened and he stepped out. Augustus St. John, Duke of Wetherby. He was 32 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that could not be taught, only inherited. His hair was dark and slightly too long, his face pale and angular, his eyes, grey-green and usually ironic, now fixed on her with an expression she could not read. He wore a greatcoat against the rain, but no hat, and his hair was wet and plastered to his forehead. He looked at the horse. He looked at the watchman. He looked at her. For a moment she saw nothing in his face. No recognition, no comprehension. Only the blankness of a man who has been interrupted and is trying to understand why. She was beneath his notice. She had always been beneath his notice. She was a companion, a piece of furniture, a woman who brought coffee and managed correspondence and vanished into the wallpaper of other people's lives. Then something shifted in his eyes, a flicker, a memory stirring. He looked at her more closely, past the wet hair and the ruined dress and the handcuffs, into the face she had tried to keep hidden from him for 3 years. "Miss Ashcroft?" he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name in 18 months. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would not explain. She had committed the crime. She would accept the consequences. He stepped closer. The watchman shifted uncertainly. This was a duke, after all, a man who could have them dismissed with a word, who could demand her release or her imprisonment according to his whim. "You stole my horse," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him, directly, for the first time in 3 years. She looked into the grey-green eyes that had laughed with her father, that had discussed philosophy in a dying man's room, that she had loved with a hopeless devotion that had defined her entire adult life. "I cannot tell you," she said. "I am sorry for the inconvenience. I will accept whatever punishment the law requires." His jaw tightened. She saw frustration in his face. the frustration of a man who was accustomed to answers, to explanations, to the deference of people who owed him everything. She was denying him that deference. She was denying him the satisfaction of understanding. "Your Grace," Cordelia's voice came from the chariot. "We must go. The delay is already dangerous. My father—" "One moment," the Duke said, without turning. "This creature has committed a felony," Cordelia said, emerging from the carriage. She was beautiful, even in the rain, even in her travelling dress, even with her hair slightly disordered. She looked at Eleanor with the contempt of a woman who has never doubted her own superiority. "She has stolen your property. She must face the consequences. We cannot allow criminals to delay us." The Duke was silent. He looked at Eleanor, at the handcuffs, at the watchman, at Cordelia. She saw the war in his face, the brief, flickering uncertainty, the moment when he might have asked more. She might have demanded the truth, might have chosen differently. Then his expression closed. The uncertainty vanished, replaced by the cold reserve that had become his armour over 11 years of dukedom. "Take her to Bow Street," he said to the watchman. "She stole my horse. Have her arrested." He turned away. He climbed back into the chariot. The door closed. The postilions cracked their whips, and the black carriage pulled away into the rain, north toward Scotland, north toward Gretna Green, north toward the disaster Eleanor had failed to prevent. She stood in the stable yard, in handcuffs, and watched him go. She did not cry. She had known for 3 years that she was invisible to him. This only confirmed it. Bow Street Magistrates' Court was a plain brick building near Covent Garden, functional and unlovely. Had the place where London's minor criminals were processed, and its major ones began their journey toward the Old Bailey and the gallows. Eleanor sat on a wooden bench in an anteroom, her hands still bound, her dress still wet, and waited for the dawn and her fate. The watchman had been kinder than she deserved. One of them, the older one with the weathered face, had given her a blanket against the chill. The other had brought her a cup of water. They did not understand her, but they did not hate her, and that small mercy felt like riches. She had spent the hours of darkness reviewing her situation with the cold clarity that had always been her gift. She was charged with horse theft, a felony under the bloody code. The penalties ranged from transportation to Australia, 7 years, 14 years, life, to death by hanging. In practice, women of gentle birth were rarely hanged for such crimes. They were more commonly transported or imprisoned. But she had no family to plead for her, no influence to mitigate her sentence, no character witnesses who would speak on her behalf. Lady Otterline would disown her. The Viscountess would be furious at the scandal, would claim to have known nothing of Eleanor's criminal tendencies, would dismiss her without reference, and ensure that no respectable household ever employed her again. Eleanor would be ruined, socially, financially, professionally. She would be lucky to find work as a laundress or a seamstress, and even those trades might reject a woman with a felony conviction. She had known all of this when she mounted Satan. She had known it, and she had done it anyway. She did not regret it. She could not regret it. The only thing she regretted was that it had not worked, that the chariot had departed, that the Duke was even now racing toward Scotland with Cordelia Hartwell, that her sacrifice had been futile as well as costly. But she had tried. She had acted. For one brief, terrible, magnificent hour, she had stopped being invisible and had become someone who did something. Even if no one ever knew why, even if he never understood, even if she spent the rest of her life in a penal colony or a prison cell, she had tried to save him. That was more than most people ever did with their love. At 6 o'clock, a clerk came for her. He was a thin young man with ink-stained fingers and the harried expression of someone who had been up all night processing drunks and thieves. "Miss Ashcroft? The magistrate will see you now." She rose. Her legs were stiff from the cold bench, her back aching, her wrists bruised from the handcuffs. She followed him down a corridor and into an office that smelled of tobacco, old paper, and the particular sourness of men who worked too hard for too little reward. Mr. Silas Crabbe sat behind a desk piled with documents. He was perhaps 60, with a bald head and sharp, dark eyes that had seen every variation of human desperation, and had long since ceased to be surprised by any of it. He looked up as she entered, and she saw his expression shift from routine boredom to something like curiosity. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. She sat. The clerk positioned himself in a corner with a notebook, ready to record the proceedings. "You are Eleanor Ashcroft," Crabbe said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, sir." "And you are charged with stealing a horse, a valuable black gelding, from the stables of the Bull and Mouth Coaching Inn, the property of Augustus St. John, Duke of Wetherby. Do you understand the charge?" "I do." "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" She had rehearsed this answer in the dark hours of the morning. She had considered lying, claiming confusion, claiming she had thought the horse was hers, claiming any of the 1,000 excuses that criminals offered in this room every day. She had considered telling the truth, explaining about Cordelia, about the elopement, about her desperate attempt to delay a disaster. She rejected both options. She would not lie. She had committed the crime. She would not compound it with dishonesty. And she would not tell the truth. Not because she feared the consequences, but because the truth belonged to him. It was his story, his impending disaster, his private shame. She had stolen his horse to protect him. She would not betray his secrets to save herself. "I have nothing to say in my defense," she said. "I stole the horse. I accept whatever punishment the law requires." Crabbe's eyebrows rose. He had not expected this. Most defendants in his court raged, wept, protested, begged. A young woman who sat with perfect composure and confessed to a capital crime without excuse or explanation was outside his experience. "You understand," he said slowly, "that horse theft is a felony? That you could be transported? Imprisoned?" "I understand." "You have no counsel? No friends to speak for you?" "I have no one. Sir." Crabbe studied her for a long moment. She saw him taking in her wet dress, her bruised wrists, her exhausted face. She saw him weighing the evidence. A woman of gentle appearance, educated speech, no criminal history, confessing to a crime that made no sense on its surface. "This is irregular, Miss Ashcroft. Most people who steal horses do so for money, for transport, for some practical purpose. You do not appear to be a professional criminal. You do not appear to be mad. Yet you stole a duke's horse in the middle of the night, in the rain, with no attempt at concealment. And now you refuse to explain yourself? Why?" She met his eyes. "I cannot tell you, sir. I am sorry." Crabbe sighed. He reached for a document, dipped his pen in ink. "Very well. I will remand you to Newgate to await trial. Given the value of the property and the status of the victim, I expect the case will be sent to the Old Bailey within a fortnight. You may apply for counsel there, though I doubt—" The door opened. Eleanor did not turn. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and listened to the footsteps enter the room. She did not need to look. She knew that stride, that particular rhythm of boots on wooden boards. She had heard it across ballrooms, across drawing rooms, across the distance of 3 years of unrequited love. "Your Grace," Crabbe said, rising. This is irregular. The proceedings— I know, the Duke said. I apologize for the interruption, but I need to speak with the prisoner. Eleanor turned. He stood in the doorway, and he looked terrible. His greatcoat was still wet, his hair still disordered, his face pale with exhaustion, and something else, something she could not identify. A tension around his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that spoke of hours without sleep, without peace, without resolution. He had not reached Scotland. She knew it immediately. He would not be here if he had. He would be in Gretna Green, married to Cordelia Hartwell, beginning the life that Eleanor had failed to prevent. His presence in this room meant that something had happened, that the chariot had stopped, that he had turned back, that the elopement had been abandoned. But she did not know why, and she would not ask. Your Grace, Crabbe said, the prisoner has confessed to the theft. She refuses to offer any defence. I was about to remand her to Newgate. The Duke stepped closer. He looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the stable yard, but more intensely, more desperately, as if he were trying to read something in her face that he had never bothered to look for before. Leave us, he said to Crabbe. Please. Crabbe hesitated. This was highly irregular. A duke alone with a female prisoner, a magistrate dismissed from his own office. But the Duke of Wetherby was one of the most powerful men in England, and Silas Crabbe was a tired old man who wanted his breakfast. I will be just outside, Crabbe said. He gathered his documents and left, the clerk trailing behind him. The door closed. They were alone. Eleanor sat very still. She would not speak first. She would not explain, apologize, or plead. She had committed the crime. She would accept the consequences. His presence changed nothing. Or rather, it changed everything. But it did not change her resolve. The Duke walked to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the grey morning, at the market carts beginning to gather in Covent Garden, at the ordinary world proceeding with its ordinary business, while their lives hung in suspension. We reached the Angel at Islington, he said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. Cordelia insisted we stop to change horses. She was impatient. She complained about the delay. She said we must reach Gretna before her father could intercept us. She said— He stopped. His hands, she noticed, were clenched at his sides. She said that her debts would be manageable once I'm a duchess. She said it as if it were a joke, as if I were not sitting 3 feet away. Eleanor said nothing. He turned to face her. I asked her what debts she meant. She laughed. She said every woman had debts, dressmakers, milliners, gambling obligations. She said it was a husband's duty to settle them. She said I should be grateful that her fortune would cover them with plenty to spare. Still, Eleanor was silent. I asked her about Sir Henry Marlowe, her previous fiancé, the one who fell from his horse in a hunting accident. She said he had been clumsy. She said she was glad to be rid of him. He had been tedious about fidelity and honour. She said I was different. She said I was practical. She said I understood the way the world worked. His voice was flat, but Eleanor heard the devastation beneath it, the slow, grinding destruction of a man's illusions, the dawning horror of recognizing a trap only after one had stepped into it. I left her at the Angel, he continued. I told her I would not marry her. I told her that I would make certain every creditor in London knew where to find her if she pursued the matter. I turned the carriage around and came back to London. Not for you. I told myself it was for answers, for the truth, for— He stopped again. But it was for you. I think it was always for you. Eleanor felt her heart contract, a sharp, painful squeeze that made it difficult to breathe. She had not expected this. She had prepared herself for his indifference, his contempt, his permanent absence from her life. She had not prepared herself for his return, his confession, his presence in this room, speaking words that sounded dangerously like understanding. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I do not expect your gratitude. I do not expect your forgiveness. I committed a crime, and I will accept the consequences. My reasons are my own." "Your reasons," he said, and there was something like anger in his voice now, "are the only thing that matters. You stole my horse in the middle of the night, in the rain, risking transportation or death, and you refuse to tell me why. You sit there with your bruised wrists and your wet dress and your perfect composure, and you tell me that your reasons are your own. They are not your own, Miss Ashcroft. They concern me. They concern me more than anything has concerned me in 11 years." She looked at him, directly, as she had in the stable yard. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the desperation in his eyes, the cracks in the ducal armor that she had never seen before. She saw a man who had been betrayed by his own judgment, who had nearly destroyed himself, who had come back to London not knowing what he would find, and had found her, still silent, still protective, still refusing to save herself at his expense. "I stole your horse," she said slowly, "because I knew that if you reached Scotland with Miss Hartwell, you would spend the rest of your life in a cage of your own making. She would manage you, manipulate you, drain you of whatever remained of your warmth and your humour and your kindness, until you became one of those hollow men who walk through drawing rooms with empty eyes. And I could not bear it. Not for myself. For you." Her voice cracked on the last word. She stopped, drew a breath, forced herself to continue. "You were kind to my father when he was dying. You made him laugh. You treated him with respect when he was too weak to demand it. That debt is paid. I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not expect anything. But I could not let you go without trying." The Duke stared at her. He had gone very pale, paler than before, the colour draining from his face as if she had struck him. 3 years, he whispered. "What?" 3 years. You have loved me for 3 years. You have watched me from across rooms, brought me coffee, corrected my Latin, managed my life from the edges of yours. And you never said a word. You let me announce my engagement to Cordelia Hartwell. You let me plan my own destruction. And the only thing you did, the only thing, was to commit a felony that could have killed you. I had no right." "No right?" His voice rose, cracking with an emotion she could not identify. Fury, grief, something beyond both. "You had every right. You had the right of someone who saw me clearly when I could not see myself. You had the right of someone who loved me without demanding anything in return. You had the right of—" He stopped. He ran his hands through his wet hair, a gesture of such exhausted desperation that she wanted, absurdly, to comfort him. "I did not see you," he said, quieter now. "I spent 3 years not seeing you, not because you were unremarkable, but because I had decided that no one would ever truly see me, so I stopped looking for anyone who might. I made myself blind, Miss Ashcroft. I made myself blind, and you paid for my blindness with your freedom." He walked to the door. He opened it. Crabbe was standing in the corridor, trying to look as if he had not been listening. "Mr. Crabbe," the Duke said, "I wish to withdraw the charge." Crabbe blinked. "Your Grace?" "The horse was not stolen. It was borrowed. Without permission, admittedly, but with no intent to deprive me of it permanently. Miss Ashcroft is guilty of nothing more than poor judgment and excessive concern for my welfare. I will not press charges. I will not testify. I will sign whatever document you require. Your Grace, Crabbe said carefully, the law does not permit the victim to simply withdraw a felony charge. The Crown will do as I ask, the Duke said, and for a moment he was every inch the Duke, cold, commanding, accustomed to obedience. I am the injured party. The horse was returned unharmed. There was no material loss, and I will make it known, in whatever circles matter, that Miss Ashcroft acted from the highest motives and with no self-interest. Crabbe looked from the Duke to Eleanor and back again. He was a tired old man, but he was not stupid. He saw what was happening here, the currents of emotion, the history between them, the way the Duke looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. Very well, he said. I will release her into your custody, Your Grace, pending formal withdrawal of the charge. She is not in my custody, the Duke said sharply. She is free. She may go where she chooses. Eleanor rose from her chair. Her legs were unsteady, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope, and she could not afford hope. Not now. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Thank you, Your Grace, she said, for your intervention. I am grateful. She walked toward the door. She did not look back at him. She could not look back at him, because if she did, she might break, might weep, might confess everything, might beg him for something she had no right to want. Miss Ashcroft. She stopped. Her hand was on the doorframe. Where will you go? She thought of Lady Otterline's house, the grand townhouse in Mayfair where she had spent 3 years as a shadow, a servant, a piece of furniture. She thought of the Viscountess's reaction to this scandal, to the knowledge that her companion had been arrested, had been released through a Duke's intervention, had become the subject of gossip that would attach itself to Lady Otterline's household like a stain. I do not know, she said. I have no family, no friends who would take me in. I will find something. Let me help you. No. The word was sharp, almost violent. She turned to face him. I will not be your charity case, Your Grace. I will not be your gratitude project, your penance, your opportunity to feel better about your own mistakes. You owe me nothing. I absolve you of all debt. What I did, because I chose to do it. The consequences are mine to bear. He stared at her. She saw the shock in his face, the shock of being refused, of having his offer of help thrown back at him. He was a duke. He was not accustomed to refusal. I know what you want, she said. You want to feel that you have made amends, that you have balanced the scales. But the scales do not balance, Your Grace. I spent 3 years loving you in silence. I spent 1 night risking everything for you. And you spent 3 years not seeing me. Those facts do not change, because you have suddenly opened your eyes. She turned and walked out of the room, out of the building, into the grey morning. She did not look back. Lady Otterline Vane received her in the front hall. Eleanor had walked from Bow Street to Mayfair, a long walk, nearly an hour, through streets that were waking to a new day, past market stalls and milkmaids and the ordinary Londoners who would never know or care that a woman had stolen a horse to prevent a duke's elopement. She had used the time to compose herself, to dry her dress as much as possible in the weak morning sun, to arrange her hair into something approaching respectability. It did not matter. Lady Otterline took one look at her and knew everything. You stupid, stupid girl, the Viscountess said. She was a handsome woman of 55, with iron grey hair and the kind of bone structure that age could not destroy, though it had hardened her face into a mask of perpetual dissatisfaction. "Do you know what they are saying? Do you know what I have heard? That my companion, was arrested in the middle of the night for stealing the Duke of Wetherby's horse, that she was taken to Bow Street in handcuffs, that the Duke himself appeared at the magistrate's office at dawn and had her released. The gossip is already spreading. By noon, every drawing room in London will know." "I am sorry for the inconvenience, my lady," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She had prepared for this. "I will collect my things and leave immediately." "You will do more than leave." Lady Otterline's voice was venomous. "You will leave without reference, without your final quarter's wages, without so much as a character that would allow you to seek employment in any respectable household. You have betrayed my trust, compromised my reputation, and made me the laughingstock of London. I should have you prosecuted myself, for theft, for fraud, for whatever charge would keep you from ever showing your face in decent society again." Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing to say. Lady Otterline's rage was justified by the standards of their world. A servant who brought scandal to her employer's house was worse than useless, was dangerous, was to be cast out without mercy. "Go," the Viscountess spat. "Pack your trunk. Be gone within the hour. If you are not gone, I will have the footman throw you into the street." Eleanor climbed the stairs to her small room under the eaves, a narrow chamber with a sloping ceiling, a narrow bed, and a window that looked out over the stable yard. She had lived here for 3 years, ever since her father's death had left her penniless, and she had accepted Lady Otterline's offer of employment. She had hated every moment of it, but it had been a roof and food and the illusion of security. Now it was gone. She packed quickly, her few dresses, her books, her father's pocket watch, the small watercolour of her mother that she had carried since childhood. Everything fit into one trunk, with room to spare. 3 years of life reduced to a single box. She left without saying goodbye to the other servants. She could not bear their pity, their curiosity, or their whispered speculation. She walked out of the servants' entrance with her trunk in her hands and 11 shillings in her purse, her entire savings, accumulated from the occasional shilling Lady Otterline had tossed her for some extra service. She found a cheap lodging house near Covent Garden, a grimy building that catered to seamstresses, charwomen, and the occasional failed actress. The landlady, a Mrs. Pettigrew with suspicious eyes and a persistent cough, demanded a week's rent in advance and showed her to a room barely larger than a cupboard, with a bed that sagged in the middle and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. Eleanor paid her. She sat on the bed. She looked at the 4 walls that constituted her new home, and she allowed herself, for the first time since the stable yard, to cry. It was not a dramatic weeping. It was a quiet, exhausted release. Tears sliding down her face, her shoulders shaking, her breath coming in small gasps that she tried to suppress in case the other lodgers heard. She cried for her father, who had died and left her alone. She cried for her lost position, her lost security, her lost future. She cried for the man she loved, who had finally seen her and could not possibly love her in return. Not truly, not as she loved him, not after 3 years of invisibility that no amount of guilt could erase. When the tears stopped, she washed her face in the basin of cold water that Mrs. Pettigrew had provided. She looked at herself in the small cracked mirror. A plain face, reddened eyes, hair that needed washing. She was 26 years old, unemployed, without references, and with 11 shillings to her name and a felony charge that had been withdrawn but not forgotten. She had 2 choices. She could surrender, apply to a charity, throw herself on the mercy of the church, accept whatever degradation the world offered to women in her position. Or she could fight, find work, any work, survive by whatever means necessary until she could rebuild some fragment of a life. She had never been a surrendering kind of woman. Her father had raised her on philosophy and independence, on the radical notion that a woman's mind was as capable as a man's. She had buried that independence for 3 years in Lady Otterline's house, but it had not died. It had only waited. She would find work. She would survive. She would not let the Duke of Wetherby, or anyone else, define her worth. The Duke did not go to his club. He did not go to his townhouse. He went to Wetherby House, his family's London residence, a vast, cold building in Grosvenor Square that he had always hated, and walked through the empty rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had spent the hours since leaving Bow Street in a state of suspended animation, unable to process what had happened, what he had learned, what he had lost and found in the space of a single night. Eleanor Ashcroft loved him. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy, painful, impossible to ignore. She had loved him for 3 years. She had watched him from across rooms, brought him coffee, corrected his Latin quotation with a smile that vanished the moment he looked at her. She had managed his life from the edges of hers, invisible and indispensable, and he had never once wondered why. He had been blind, deliberately, willfully blind. He had decided, at some point after inheriting the dukedom, that love was a luxury he could not afford. He had trained himself not to look for it, not to expect it, not to believe that anyone could see past the title to the man beneath. And in training himself not to look, he had missed the one person who had been looking all along. He poured himself a brandy. He did not drink it. He stared out the window at the square, at the ordinary morning proceeding with ordinary business, and tried to understand how his life had changed. Cordelia Hartwell was gone. Not literally, but effectively. She had returned to her father's house, no doubt plotting revenge, but she would not get it. The Duke had spent the hours between Islington and Mayfair making certain of that. He had written to his solicitor, to his man of business, to the 3 men who controlled the most dangerous gossip in London. He had ensured that Cordelia's debts, her cruelty, her previous engagement's suspicious end would become known in the circles that mattered. He had broken their engagement publicly and permanently, and he had done it with a ruthlessness that surprised even himself. But that was duty. That was self-preservation. That was the easy part. The hard part was Eleanor. She had refused his help. She had looked at him with those steady, exhausted eyes and told him that she would not be his charity case, his gratitude project, his penance. She had absolved him of all debt and walked away into the morning, leaving him standing in a magistrate's office feeling like the smallest man in London. She was right, of course. She was absolutely right. He could not fix 3 years of blindness with a bank draft and a position in some country household. He could not balance the scales of her sacrifice with his guilt. The scales did not balance. They would never balance. But he could not let her go. He could not accept that she would disappear into poverty and obscurity while he remained a duke with all the power and privilege that implied. He could not accept that the only person who had ever truly seen him would vanish from his life because he had been too stupid to see her in return. He needed to find her, not to rescue her. She would refuse rescue, and rightly so. But to know her, to learn her, to earn, somehow, the right to stand in her presence without feeling like a fraud. He set down the untouched brandy. He rang for his secretary. He began to write letters. Eleanor spent her first week of freedom in a state of grim, practical activity. She applied for positions: governess, companion, lady's maid, even housekeeper in a small establishment. She was refused everywhere. Without references, without a character from her previous employer, she was unemployable in any household that cared about respectability. She considered her skills. She could read and write in 3 languages. She could manage correspondence, accounts, household budgets. She could ride, though that was hardly a marketable skill for a woman. She could play the pianoforte, paint watercolors, embroider, all the accomplishments of a gentlewoman, none of which earned money. She was considering application to a dressmaker or a milliner, trades that might accept a gentlewoman's education, when she saw the advertisement in a newspaper that Mrs. Pettigrew left in the common room. Wanted. A governess for 2 young ladies, aged 8 and 10, in a quiet Hertfordshire village. Must be able to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, French, and deportment. References required, but character may be established through trial. Salary £20 per annum, with board. It was not ideal. The salary was low, the location remote, the requirement for references still present. But it was something. It was a door that was not entirely closed. Eleanor wrote a letter. She explained, with careful honesty, that she had been employed for 3 years as a companion to Lady Ottoline Vane, but had left that position without a character due to a personal disagreement. She offered to establish her qualifications through a trial period, to teach a sample lesson, to submit to any test the family required. She received a reply within 3 days. The family, a Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, the father a retired naval officer, were willing to consider her. They invited her to come for a week's trial. Eleanor accepted. She used her remaining shillings for coach fare and arrived in the village of Little Marlow with her trunk and her determination and nothing else. The Blackwoods were kind people, not wealthy, not sophisticated, but decent. Mr. Blackwood was gruff and absent-minded, more interested in his garden than his children. Mrs. Blackwood was anxious, overprotective, desperate for someone to manage the girls' education so she could stop worrying about it. The girls, Lucy and Emily, were bright, energetic, and inclined to mischief. Eleanor taught them. She established rules, routines, expectations. She read with them, wrote with them, drilled them in French verbs and multiplication tables. She was strict but fair, and the girls responded to her certainty. The certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose, and therefore had nothing to fear. At the end of the week, the Blackwoods offered her the position. She accepted. She moved into a small room at the top of the house, with a view of the garden and the distant hills, and began to build a new life. It was not the life she had imagined. It was small, isolated, far from the intellectual stimulation she had known with her father, far from the social world she had inhabited even as a companion. But it was honest work, and it was hers, and it allowed her to survive without charity or compromise. She did not think about the Duke, or rather, she thought about him constantly, in the early mornings, in the late evenings, in the quiet moments between lessons. But she did not allow herself to hope. He had withdrawn the charge. He had tried to help. He had perhaps felt something: guilt, gratitude, the stirring of recognition. But he was a duke, and she was a governess in a Hertfordshire village, and the distance between them was greater than any emotion could bridge. She told herself she was content. She almost believed it. The Duke found her in the 3rd week of September. He had hired a man, a former Bow Street runner named Finch, who specialised in finding people who did not wish to be found. Finch had traced her to Mrs. Pettigrew's lodging house, learned of her departure for Hertfordshire, and followed her to Little Marlow. He reported back with her direction, her employment, her apparent health. The Duke went himself. He did not take his crested carriage. That would have announced his presence to the entire village. He hired a plain travelling chariot and arrived at the Blackwood house on a wet afternoon, unannounced, in a coat that might have belonged to any gentleman of moderate means. Mrs. Blackwood answered the door. She was overwhelmed. A duke at her door, in her modest house, asking to see the governess. She stammered, curtsied, showed him into the parlour, and sent a maid to fetch Miss Ashcroft. Eleanor came down from the nursery. She was wearing a plain grey dress, the same grey she had always worn, as if she were determined to remain invisible even now. Her hair was pinned back simply. Her face was bare of cosmetics. She looked exactly as she had looked in Bow Street, exhausted, composed, unremarkable to anyone who did not know how to look. She stopped in the doorway of the parlour. She saw him, and her expression did not change. Or rather, it changed so subtly that only someone who had learned to read her would notice. A tightening around the eyes, a slight parting of the lips, a stillness that spoke of shock held rigidly in check. "Your Grace," she said, "this is unexpected." "I know," he said. "I apologize for the intrusion." "Mrs. Blackwood," Eleanor said, turning to her employer, who hovered in the doorway with undisguised curiosity. "Would you excuse us? His Grace and I have a previous acquaintance. We will not disturb your household." Mrs. Blackwood withdrew, reluctantly. Eleanor closed the parlour door. She did not sit. She stood with her back to the window, her hands folded, and waited. "You found me?" she said. "I did." "Why?" The Duke had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his mind. He had prepared speeches, explanations, apologies. Now, facing her in this modest parlour with its faded furniture and its smell of beeswax, he found that all his words had deserted him. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I only know that I could not let you disappear, that I could not accept a world in which you were here and I was there, and I had never—" He stopped. "I never thanked you, properly, not for the horse, for seeing me when I could not see myself." "You did thank me," she said. "You withdrew the charge. You tried to offer help. That was sufficient." "It was not sufficient. It was the minimum decency required by the situation. I want to do more than the minimum. I told you, I know what you told me, that you will not be my charity case, that you will not be my gratitude project. And I accept that. I do not come to offer you money or position or any material assistance. I come to offer you myself, my company, my conversation, the chance to know me, if you wish to, as I wish to know you." Eleanor stared at him. She had not expected this humility, this openness, this willingness to be refused. The Duke she had known for 3 years was cold, reserved, armoured in ducal privilege. This man was different. This man was uncertain, and the uncertainty made him seem almost human. "I am a governess," she said. "I have duties. I cannot entertain visitors at my employer's convenience." "I know. I will not disturb your work. I only ask permission to write, to correspond, to send letters that you may answer or not, as you choose." "Letters," she repeated, as if the word were foreign. "Letters. About books, about politics, about whatever you find interesting." "I have spent 3 years not knowing what interests you, Miss Ashcroft. I would like to correct that omission." She was silent for a long moment. She looked out the window at the garden, at the rain falling on the late roses, at the ordinary world proceeding with its ordinary business. "One letter," she said finally. "I will read one letter. I make no promise to answer it." He smiled, a small, tired, genuine smile that transformed his face from handsome to something approaching beautiful. "One letter," he agreed. "That is more than I deserve." He left. He did not touch her. He did not attempt to press his advantage. He walked out of the parlour, out of the house, into the rain, and she watched him go with a feeling she could not name. The first letter arrived 3 days later. It was not a love letter. It was not even, strictly speaking, a personal letter. It was a discussion of a book, Rousseau's Emile, which Eleanor had mentioned in passing during one of their conversations in her father's sick room years ago. The Duke wrote 3 pages analysing Rousseau's theories of education, critiquing his assumptions about gender, questioning whether a man who abandoned his own children was qualified to lecture others on child-rearing. It was witty, erudite, and slightly pedantic, exactly the kind of letter her father might have written. Eleanor read it 3 times. She did not answer it. The second letter arrived a week later. This one discussed the Corn Laws, the recent parliamentary debate, the Duke's own ambivalence about protectionism. He wrote as if to an equal, not explaining basics, not condescending, but engaging with her as a mind worth addressing. She still did not answer. The third letter, after another week, was shorter. It described a ridiculous incident in the House of Lords. An elderly earl who had fallen asleep during a speech and snored so loudly that the speaker had been unable to continue. The Duke wrote it with a dry humour that made Eleanor laugh aloud in her small room, startling herself with the sound. She wrote back. Her letter was 1 sentence. "The book you mentioned is better in the original French." It was not much. It was barely a beginning. But it was a crack in the wall she had built around herself, and the Duke seized it with both hands. His next letter was 6 pages. A discussion of French philosophy, a recommendation of Madame de Staël's Corinne, a description of a painting he had seen at the Royal Academy, a question about the girls she taught, and whether they preferred poetry or history. It was conversational, discursive, intimate, without being improper. She answered in kind, 2 pages this time. Her thoughts on Corinne, her opinion of the painting, a brief anecdote about Lucy Blackwood's attempt to teach the cat French verbs. She signed it simply, E.A. The correspondence continued. For 3 months, they wrote to each other weekly, sometimes more often. They discussed books, politics, art, philosophy. They argued about the merits of Byron's poetry. She admired it. He found it self-indulgent. They debated the proper education for women. She believed in rigorous intellectual training. He agreed, with reservations about social consequences. They shared observations about the world, his from the height of dukedom, hers from the nursery of a retired naval officer. They did not discuss love. They did not discuss the night she stole his horse. They did not discuss the 3 years of her silence or his blindness. Those subjects hung between them like ghosts, acknowledged by their absence, too dangerous to name. But something grew in the space between the words, a connection, a recognition, a slow and careful building of trust. Eleanor found herself living for the letters, for the sound of the postman's knock, for the moments when she could retreat to her room and open the familiar handwriting and feel, for a little while, that she was not alone. She did not delude herself. She knew that letters were not life, that words on paper were not the same as presence, that a duke who wrote charming letters might still be incapable of the kind of love she needed. But she allowed herself, cautiously, to hope. Not for marriage, not for rescue, not for the fairy tale ending of novels, but for friendship, for respect, for the possibility of being seen, truly seen. by the only man who had ever made the effort. December came, and with it the end of the Blackwood girls' term. The family went to London for the holidays, leaving Eleanor alone in the house with a skeleton staff and her correspondence. The Duke's letters had changed in recent weeks. They had become more personal, less about books and politics, more about himself. He wrote about his brother, who had died at 23 in a boating accident that had also killed their father. He wrote about the weight of the dukedom, the endless responsibilities, the way he had learned to perform competence until he forgot what genuine confidence felt like. He wrote about his loneliness, not as a complaint, but as a fact, like weather. Eleanor responded in kind. She wrote about her father, his brilliance, his eccentricity, his death. She wrote about the 3 years with Lady Otterline, the slow erosion of her spirit, the way she had made herself small to survive. She wrote about the night she stole his horse, not to excuse herself, but to explain the desperation that had driven her, the certainty that had overridden fear, the love that had made her reckless. It was the closest they had come to naming what existed between them. On Christmas Eve, a letter arrived that was different from the others. It was short, only a paragraph, and it contained an invitation. I will be at Wetherby House in Berkshire for the holidays. The house is large and cold and mostly empty, but the stables are warm and the horses miss you. If you would consider a visit, not as my guest, not as anything that would compromise your independence, I would like to show you something. You may, of course, refuse. You may always refuse. Eleanor read it a dozen times. She considered the implications. A single woman visiting a single man, even with servants present, even with the most proper arrangements. She considered her reputation, which was already damaged beyond repair. She considered her heart, which was beating faster than it should. She wrote back, I will come for 1 day. I will bring my own conveyance. I will leave before dark. Wetherby House was not what she expected. She had imagined something grand and oppressive, a monument to ducal power, all marble and gilt and intimidating proportions. Instead, she found a house that was large, certainly, but also slightly shabby, comfortable, lived in. The furniture was old and well used. The books were everywhere, in the library, in the drawing room, stacked on tables and windowsills. The house smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the particular scent of a place that was loved rather than displayed. The Duke met her at the door. He was not in formal dress. He wore a plain coat and boots, as if he had been working in the stables himself. His hair was disordered. His face was open, unguarded, younger than she had ever seen him. Thank you for coming, he said simply. You said you wanted to show me something. I do. But first, will you walk with me? They walked through the park, a vast, rolling landscape of winter-bare trees and frost-crisp grass, with views of the Berkshire Downs in the distance. They talked as they walked, the conversation flowing easily after months of letters. They discussed the girls she taught, the book he was reading, the political crisis that was threatening to bring down the government. They did not discuss why she was there. They did not need to. Eventually, they reached the stables, a long, low building of weathered brick, warm with the smell of horses and hay. The Duke opened the door and stood aside to let her enter. It was her father's stable. Not literally, of course, but it was the same size, the same layout, the same atmosphere of quiet competence and animal contentment. There were 6 horses, not the dozens that a duke might keep, but a careful, chosen few. And in the first stall, looking out at her with dark, intelligent eyes, was Satan. I bought him from my own stable, the Duke said. He was never happy there, Too much competition, too little attention. I thought he might prefer the country. And I thought—" He paused. "I thought you might like to see him again." Eleanor approached the stall. The horse nickered, recognizing her scent, and pushed his nose against her hand. She felt the soft warmth of his breath, the velvet of his muzzle, and something broke open in her chest. A grief for her father, for his small stable in Oxford, for the life she had lost and the life she was trying to build. "Thank you," she whispered. "There is more," the Duke said. He led her to the end of the stable block, to a stall that was larger than the others, cleaner, filled with fresh straw. Inside stood a horse she did not recognize, a bay mare, gentle-eyed, heavily pregnant. "She is a Suffolk punch," the Duke said. "A draught breed, strong and steady. She will foal in the spring. I hoped, that you might teach me to care for her. I know nothing of horses, really. I inherited them, like everything else. But I would like to learn." Eleanor looked at him. She saw the uncertainty in his face, the same uncertainty she had seen in the Blackwoods' parlour, the vulnerability of a man who was offering something without knowing if it would be accepted. "Why?" she asked. "Because you love them. Because they are part of who you are, part of what I failed to see. Because I spent 3 years not knowing that you could ride like a demon, that you understood horses better than most men, that this," he gestured at the stable, "was part of your history. I want to know your history, Miss Ashcroft. I want to know everything." They stood in the stable, surrounded by the warmth and the smell of horses, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a final loosening of the armor she had worn for 3 years, a willingness to be vulnerable, to be seen, to risk hope. "Eleanor," she said. "My name is Eleanor." "Eleanor," he repeated. "May I show you one more thing?" He led her out of the stable, across the frosted grass, to a small cottage at the edge of the park, a stone building with a thatched roof, a garden, a view of the downs. It was charming, modest, clearly recently renovated. "This is the dower house," he said. "Or it was. It has been empty for years. I had it repaired. New roof, new windows, a proper kitchen. It is not grand. It is not even particularly comfortable by ducal standards. But it is yours, if you want it. Not as a gift, not as charity. As a tenant, with a proper lease, at a fair rent. You could translate— I know you have been translating French texts for the Blackwood girls. You could write. You could ride. You could be— yourself." Eleanor walked through the cottage, the small parlour with its fireplace, the kitchen with its new stove, the bedroom with its window looking out over the downs. It was perfect. It was exactly what she needed. Independence, proximity, the possibility of a life that was hers alone. "And you?" she asked. "Where would you be?" "At the big house." He smiled, self-deprecating. "Cold and oppressive and full of responsibilities. But close. Close enough to visit. Close enough to try." "To try what?" "To be what you deserve. What I should have been 3 years ago. A man who sees you, who knows you, who earns the right to stand in your presence." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, as she had in the stable yard and the magistrate's office and every moment since. She saw the man he was, weary, uncertain, burdened by duty but capable of warmth, of humour, of the kind of love that was built on recognition rather than passion. "I do not need you to be what I deserve," she said. "I need you to be what you are, to be honest, to be present, to not make me invisible again." "Never," he said. "I swear it." "Do not swear. Just do." He nodded. He reached out, slowly, carefully, giving her time to withdraw, and took her hand. His fingers were cold from the winter air, but his grip was warm, firm, real. "Eleanor," he said, "I spent 3 years not seeing you. I will spend the rest of my life making sure I never stop. Will you let me try?" She looked at their joined hands. She looked at the cottage that could be her home. She looked at the man who had finally learned to see her, and she felt the last of her resistance dissolve, not into surrender, but into choice, into the deliberate, courageous decision to love him not as a dream or a fantasy, but as a flawed, real, present man. "Yes," she said, "I will let you try." Spring came to Berkshire with the slow, inevitable beauty that Eleanor had forgotten during her years in London. The frost retreated from the fields. The trees budded, leafed, turned the downs into a rolling sea of green. The mare, whom Eleanor had named Hope, with an irony that softened over time, foaled on a warm April morning, producing a leggy colt with his mother's gentle eyes. Eleanor lived in the cottage. She translated philosophical texts for a London publisher, earning enough to pay her rent and maintain her independence. She rode every morning, sometimes on Satan, sometimes on Hope, sometimes on the new colt when he was old enough. She gardened. She wrote letters, not only to the Duke, but to the Blackwood girls, to a few old acquaintances from her Oxford days, to the world she was slowly rebuilding. The Duke visited daily. At first he came formally, riding over from the big house in the morning, leaving before luncheon. They discussed books, politics, the management of the estate. He asked her advice on agricultural reform, on tenant relations, on the education of his younger cousins. He treated her as an equal, a confidant, a mind he respected. Gradually, the visits became longer, less formal. He stayed for meals. He helped in the garden, badly, but with enthusiasm. He learned to care for the horses, guided by her expertise, accepting her corrections with good humour. He became, over months of proximity, a fixture in her life. Not a duke, not a rescuer, but a man. Her man. The man she had loved for 3 years, now finally known and knowing in return. They did not marry. Not immediately. Eleanor refused his first proposal, gently but firmly, because she was not ready to surrender her independence, because she needed to know that he loved her as Eleanor rather than as a duchess-to-be, because she had spent too long making herself small to rush into a role that would make her small again. He accepted her refusal. He did not press. He continued to visit, to write, to be present. He proved, by the only means that mattered, that his love was not contingent on possession. She proposed to him, 6 months later, on a morning ride across the downs. They had stopped to rest the horses, looking out over the valley where the Wetherby estate spread below them, the big house, the cottages, the fields, the life they were building together. "Augustus," she said. She had begun to use his given name in private, an intimacy that still felt slightly daring. "I do not want to be your duchess. I want to be your wife. There is a difference." He looked at her, the grey-green eyes that had once been blind, now seeing her with a clarity that made her breath catch. "What is the difference?" he asked. "A duchess is a role. A wife is a choice. I choose you, not your title, not your estate. You, the man who sat with my father, the man who learned to muck out a stable, the man who wrote me letters for 3 months without asking for a reply." He smiled. That transformation she loved, the way his face changed from handsome to beautiful when he was genuinely happy. "And I choose you," he said. "The woman who stole my horse, the woman who refused my help, the woman who taught me to see." They were married in the village church, quietly, with only the Blackwoods and a few local tenants as witnesses. The Duke's family, what remained of it, was scandalized by the modesty of the affair, by the bride's lack of fortune and connections, by the whispers that would follow them into society. They did not care. They rode home from the church together, not in a carriage, but on horseback, she on Satan, he on a steady grey gelding he had learned to love. They rode across the downs in the September sunshine, side by side, matching their pace to each other, looking out at the world they had made. She was not invisible anymore. She had never been invisible, really, only unseen. And he had learned to see, not because she had demanded it, but because she had shown him what sight meant. Not power, not possession, recognition. The radical, revolutionary act of looking at another person and seeing them as they are. They rode on into their future. Two people who had found each other not through luck or design, but through the courage to be seen.